Julius Robert Oppenheimer, was an American theoretical physicist and director of the Manhattan Project's Los Alamos laboratory during World War II. He is often called the father of the atomic bomb. Born in New York City at April 22, 1904, Oppenheimer earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in chemistry from Harvard University in 1925 and a doctorate in physics from the University of Göttingen in Germany in 1927, where he studied under Max Born. After research at other institutions, he joined the physics department at the University of California, Berkeley, where he became a full professor in 1936. He made significant contributions to theoretical physics, including achievements in quantum mechanics and nuclear physics, such as the Born-Oppenheimer approximation for molecular wave functions, work on the theory of electrons and positrons, the Oppenheimer-Phillips process in nuclear fusion, and the first prediction of quantum tunneling with his students. He also made contributions to the theory of neutron stars and black holes, quantum field theory, and the interactions of cosmic rays. In 1942, Oppenheimer was recruited to work on the Manhattan Project, and the following year he was appointed director of the project's Los Alamos laboratory in New Mexico. Tasked with developing the first nuclear weapons, his leadership and scientific expertise were instrumental in the project's success. On July 16, 1945, he was present at the first test of the atomic bomb, Trinity, in August 1945. The weapons were used against Japan in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the only use to date of nuclear weapons in an armed conflict. In 1947, Oppenheimer became the director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, and he chaired the influential General Advisory Committee of the newly created U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. He lobbied for international control of nuclear power to avert nuclear proliferation and a nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union. He opposed the development of the hydrogen bomb during 1949 to 1950 governmental debate on the question, and subsequently took positions on defense-related issues that provoked the ire of some U.S. government and military factions. During the Second Red Scare, Oppenheimer's stances, together with his past associations with the Communist Party USA, led to the revocation of his security clearance following a 1954 security hearing. This effectively ended his access to the government's atomic secrets and thus his career as a nuclear physicist. Stripped also of his direct political influence, Oppenheimer continued to lecture, write, and work in physics. In 1963, he was awarded the Enrico Fermi Award as a gesture of political rehabilitation. He died 4 years later from throat cancer in 2022. The 1954 revocation of Oppenheimer's security clearance was vacated by the US government. Childhood and education. Oppenheimer was born into a non-observant Jewish family in New York City on April 22, 1904, to Ellen E. Friedman, a painter, and Julius Seligmann Oppenheimer, a successful textile importer. Julius was born in Hanau, then part of the Hesse-Nassau province of the Kingdom of Prussia, and came to the United States as a teenager in 1888 with few resources and no money, baccalaureate studies, or knowledge of the English language. He was hired by a textile company, and within a decade was an executive there, eventually becoming wealthy. In 1912, the family moved to an apartment on Riverside Drive near West 88th Street, Manhattan, an area known for luxurious mansions and townhouses. Their art collection included works by Pablo Picasso and Eduard Voulard, and at least 3 original paintings by Vincent van Gogh. Robert had a younger brother, Frank, who also became a physicist. Oppenheimer was initially educated at Aalchen Preparatory School. In 1911, he entered the Ethical Culture Society School, founded by Felix Adler to promote training based on the ethical culture movement, whose motto was Deed Before Creed. Oppenheimer's father had been a member of the society for many years, serving on its board of trustees. Oppenheimer was a versatile student, interested in English and French literature, and particularly in mineralogy. He completed 3rd and 4th grades in 1 year and skipped half of 8th grade. During his final year, Oppenheimer became interested in chemistry. He graduated in 1921, but his further education was delayed a year by an attack of colitis contracted while prospecting in Warkimstal during a family vacation in Czechoslovakia. He recovered in New Mexico, where he developed a love for horseback riding and the southwestern United States. At age 18, Oppenheimer entered Harvard College, where he majored in chemistry. Harvard also required studies in history, literature, and philosophy or mathematics. He compensated for his late start by taking 6 courses each term instead of the usual 4. He was admitted to the undergraduate honor society Phi Beta Kappa and was granted graduate standing in physics on the basis of independent study, which meant he could bypass basic courses in favor of advanced ones. He was attracted to experimental physics by a course on thermodynamics taught by Percy Bridgman in 1925 after only 3 years. Oppenheimer graduated from Harvard with a Bachelor of Arts Studies in Europe after being accepted at Christ's College, Cambridge in 1924. Oppenheimer wrote to Ernest Rutherford requesting permission to work at the Cavendish Laboratory, though Bridgman's letter of recommendation said that Oppenheimer's clumsiness in the laboratory suggested that theoretical, rather than experimental, physics would be his forte. Rutherford was unimpressed, but Oppenheimer went to Cambridge nonetheless. Joseph John Thomson ultimately accepted him on the condition that he complete a basic laboratory course. Oppenheimer was very unhappy at Cambridge and wrote to a friend, "I am having a pretty bad time. The lab work is a terrible bore, and I am so bad at it that it is impossible to feel that I am learning anything." He developed an antagonistic relationship with his tutor, Patrick Blackett, a future Nobel laureate, according to Oppenheimer's friend Francis Ferguson. Oppenheimer once confessed to leaving an apple doused with poison on Blackett's desk. No one ate it. Oppenheimer's parents convinced the university authorities not to press criminal charges or expel him. Instead, Oppenheimer was placed on probation and had to have regular sessions with a psychiatrist in Harley Street, London. Oppenheimer was a tall, thin chain smoker who often neglected to eat during periods of intense concentration. Many friends said he could be self-destructive. Ferguson once tried to distract Oppenheimer from his apparent depression by telling him that Ferguson was to marry his girlfriend. Oppenheimer jumped on Ferguson and tried to strangle him. Oppenheimer was plagued by periods of depression throughout his life and once told his brother, "I need physics more than friends." In 1926, Oppenheimer left Cambridge for the University of Göttingen to study under Max Born. Göttingen was one of the world's leading centers for theoretical physics. Oppenheimer made friends who went on to great success, including Werner Heisenberg, Pascual Jordan, Wolfgang Pauli, Paul Dirac, Enrico Fermi, and Edward Teller. He was enthusiastic in discussion to the point of sometimes taking them over. Maria Goeppert presented Born with a petition signed by herself and others threatening a boycott of the class unless he made Oppenheimer quiet down. Born left it out on his desk where Oppenheimer could read it, and it was effective without a word being said. Oppenheimer obtained his Doctor of Philosophy degree in March 1927 at age 23, supervised by Max Born. After the oral exam, James Frank, the professor administering, reportedly said, "I'm glad that's over. He was on the point of questioning me." Oppenheimer published more than a dozen papers, while in Europe, including many important contributions to the new field of quantum mechanics. He and Born published a famous paper on the Born-Oppenheimer approximation, which separates nuclear motion from electronic motion in the mathematical treatment of molecules. Allowing nuclear motion to be neglected to simplify calculations, it remains his most cited work. Early career teaching. Oppenheimer was awarded United States National Research Council Fellowship to the California Institute of Technology Caltech in September 1927. Bridgman also wanted him at Harvard, so a compromise was reached whereby he split his fellowship. For the 1927-28 academic year between Harvard in 1927 and Caltech in 1928. At Caltech, he struck up a close friendship with Linus Pauling. They planned to mount a joint attack on the nature of the chemical bond, a field in which Pauling was a pioneer, with Oppenheimer supplying the mathematics and Pauling interpreting the results. The collaboration and their friendship ended after Oppenheimer invited Pauling's wife, Ava Helen Pauling, to join him on a tryst in Mexico. Oppenheimer later invited Pauling to be head of the chemistry division of the Manhattan Project, but Pauling refused, saying he was a pacifist. In the autumn of 1928, Oppenheimer visited Paul Ehrenfest's institute at the University of Leiden, the Netherlands, where he impressed by giving lectures in Dutch. Despite having little experience with the language there, he was given the nickname of Och, later anglicized by his students as Oppie. From Leiden, he continued on to the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology (DH) in Zurich to work with Wolfgang Pauli on quantum mechanics and the continuous spectrum. Oppenheimer respected and liked Pauli and may have emulated his personal style as well as his critical approach to problems. On returning to the United States, Oppenheimer accepted an associate professorship from the University of California, Berkeley, where Raymond T. Burge wanted him so badly that he expressed a willingness to share him with Caltech. Before he began his Berkeley professorship, Oppenheimer was diagnosed with a mild case of tuberculosis and spent some weeks with his brother Frank at a New Mexico ranch, which he leased and eventually purchased. When he heard the ranch was available for lease, he exclaimed, "Hot dog," and he later called it Perro Caliente hot dog in Spanish. Later, he used to say that physics and desert country were his two great loves. He recovered from tuberculosis and returned to Berkeley, where he prospered as an advisor and collaborator to a generation of physicists who admired him for his intellectual virtuosity and broad interests. His students and colleagues saw him as mesmerizing, hypnotic in private interaction, but often frigid in more public settings. His associates fell into two camps. One saw him as an aloof and impressive genius and aesthete, the other as a pretentious and insecure person. His students almost always fell into the former category, adopting his walk, speech, and other mannerisms, and even his inclination for reading entire texts in their original languages. Hans Bethe said of him, probably the most important ingredient he brought to his teaching was his exquisite taste. He always knew what were the important problems, as shown by his choice of subjects. He truly lived with those problems, struggling for a solution, and he communicated his concern to the group. In its heyday, there were about 8 or 10 graduate students in his group and about 6 postdoctoral fellows. He met this group once a day in his office and discussed with one after another the status of the student's research problem. He was interested in everything, and in one afternoon they might discuss quantum electrodynamics, cosmic rays, electron pair production, and nuclear physics. Oppenheimer worked closely with Nobel Prize-winning experimental physicist Ernest Lawrence and his cyclotron pioneers, helping them understand the data that their machines were producing at Berkeley's radiation laboratory, which eventually developed into today's Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. In 1936, Berkeley promoted him to full professor at an annual salary of $3,300. In return, he was asked to curtail his teaching at Caltech, so a compromise was reached whereby Berkeley released him for 6 weeks each year, enough to teach 1 term at Caltech. Scientific work. Oppenheimer did important research in theoretical astronomy, especially as related to general relativity and nuclear theory, nuclear physics, spectroscopy, and quantum field theory, including its extension into quantum electrodynamics. The formal mathematics of relativistic quantum mechanics also attracted his attention, although he doubted its validity. His work predicted many later finds, including the neutron, meson, and neutron star. Initially, his major interest was the theory of the continuous spectrum, his first published paper in 1926. concerned the quantum theory of molecular band spectra. He developed a method to carry out calculations of its transition probabilities. He calculated the photoelectric effect for hydrogen and X-rays, obtaining the absorption coefficient at the kh. His calculations accorded with observations of the X-ray absorption of the Sun, but not helium. Years later, it was realized that the Sun was largely composed of hydrogen, and that his calculations were correct. Oppenheimer made important contributions to the theory of cosmic ray showers and started work that eventually led to descriptions of quantum tunneling. In 1931, he co-wrote a paper, Relativistic Theory of the Photoelectric Effect, with his student Harvey Hall, in which, based on empirical evidence, he correctly disputed Dirac's assertion that two of the energy levels of the hydrogen atom have the same energy. Subsequently, one of his doctoral students, Willis Lamb, determined that this was a consequence of the Lamb shift, for which Lamb was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1955. With his first doctoral student, Melba Phillips, Oppenheimer worked on calculations of artificial radioactivity under bombardment by deuterons. When Ernest Lawrence and Edwin Macmillan bombarded nuclei with deuterons, they found the results agreed closely with the predictions of George Gamow. But when higher energies and heavier nuclei were involved, the results did not conform to the theory. In 1935, Oppenheimer and Phillips worked out a theory, the Oppenheimer-Phillips process, to explain the results. This theory is still in use today. Private and political life. During the 1920s, Oppenheimer remained uninformed on worldly matters. He claimed that he did not read newspapers or popular magazines, and only learned of the Wall Street crash of 1929 while he was on a walk with Ernest Lawrence 6 months after the crash occurred. He once remarked that he never cast a vote until the 1936 presidential election. From 1934 on, he became increasingly concerned about politics and international affairs. In 1934, he earmarked 3% of his annual salary, about $100 for 2 years, to support German physicists fleeing Nazi Germany. During the 1934 West Coast waterfront strike, he and some of his students, including Melba Phillips and Bob Serber, attended a longshoremen's rally. Oppenheimer repeatedly attempted to get Serber position at Berkeley, but was blocked by Berkeley Physics Department Administrator Raymond T. Burge, who felt that one Jew in the department was enough. Oppenheimer's mother died in 1931, and he became closer to his father, who, although still living in New York, became a frequent visitor in California. When his father died in 1937, leaving $392,600, equivalent to $7.99 million in 2022, to be divided between Oppenheimer and his brother Frank. Oppenheimer immediately wrote out a will that left his estate to the University of California to be used for graduate scholarships. Like many young intellectuals in the 1930s, Oppenheimer supported social reforms that were later categorized as communist ideas. He donated to many progressive causes considered left-wing during the McCarthy era. Most of his allegedly radical work consisted of hosting fundraisers for the Republican cause in the Spanish Civil War and other anti-fascist activity. He never openly joined the Communist Party USA, though he did give money to leftist causes by way of acquaintances who were alleged to be members. When he joined the Manhattan Project in 1942, Oppenheimer wrote on his personal security questionnaire that he had been a member of just about every Communist Front organization on the West Coast. Years later, he claimed that he did not remember saying this, that it was not true, and that if he had said anything along those lines, it was a half-jocular overstatement. He was a subscriber to the People's World, a Communist Party organ, and he testified in 1954, "I was associated with the communist movement from 1937 to 1942. Oppenheimer was a member at Berkeley of what he called a discussion group, which was later identified by fellow members, Håkon Chevalier and Gordon Griffiths, as a closed secret unit of the Communist Party for Berkeley faculty. The FBI opened a file on Oppenheimer in March 1941. It recorded that he attended a meeting in December 1940 at Chevalier's home that was also attended by the Communist Party's California State Secretary, William Schneiderman, and its treasurer, Isaac Folkoff. The FBI noted that Oppenheimer was on the executive committee of the American Civil Liberties Union, which it considered a communist front organization. Shortly thereafter, the FBI added Oppenheimer to its custodial detention index for arrest in case of national emergency. Oppenheimer's party membership, or lack thereof, has been debated. Almost all historians agree he had strong left-wing views during this time and interacted with party members, but it is disputed whether he was officially a member of the party. At his 1954 security clearance hearings, he denied being a member of the Communist Party but identified himself as a fellow traveler, which he defined as someone who agrees with many of communism's goals but is not willing to blindly follow orders from any Communist Party apparatus. Manhattan Project, Los Alamos, on October 9, 1941. 2 months before the United States entered World War II, President Franklin D. Roosevelt approved a crash program to develop an atomic bomb. Lawrence brought Oppenheimer into the project on October 21st. On May 18, 1942, National Defense Research Committee Chairman James B. Conant, who had been one of Oppenheimer's lecturers at Harvard, asked Oppenheimer to take over work on fast neutron calculations, a task Oppenheimer threw himself into with full vigor. He was given the title Coordinator of Rapid Rupture, which specifically referred to the propagation of a fast neutron chain reaction in an atomic bomb. One of his first acts was to host a summer school for bomb theory in Berkeley. The mix of European physicists and his own students, a group including Robert Serber, Emil Kanopinski, Felix Bloch, Hans Bethe and Edward Teller, kept themselves busy by calculating what needed to be done and in what order to make the bomb. In June 1942, the US Army established the Manhattan Engineer District to handle its part in the atom bomb project, beginning the process of transferring responsibility from the Office of Scientific Research and Development to the military. In September, Brigadier General Leslie A. Groves, Jr. was appointed director of what became known as the Manhattan Project. By October 12, 1942, Groves and Oppenheimer had decided that for security and cohesion, they needed to establish a centralized, secret research laboratory in a remote location. Groves selected Oppenheimer to head the project's secret weapons laboratory, although it is not known precisely when. This decision surprised many, because Oppenheimer had left-wing political views and no record as a leader of large projects. Groves worried that because Oppenheimer did not have a Nobel Prize, he might not have had the prestige to direct fellow scientists. But Groves was impressed by Oppenheimer's singular grasp of the practical aspects of the project and by the breadth of his knowledge. As a military engineer, Groves knew that this would be vital in an interdisciplinary project that would involve not just physics, but also chemistry, metallurgy, ordnance, and engineering. Groves also detected in Oppenheimer something that many others did not, an overweening ambition, which Groves reckoned would supply the drive necessary to push the project to a successful conclusion. Robbie considered the appointment a real stroke of genius on the part of General Groves, who was not generally considered to be a genius. Oppenheimer favored a location for the laboratory in New Mexico, not far from his ranch. On November 16, 1942, he, Groves and others toured a prospective site. Oppenheimer feared that the high cliffs surrounding it would feel claustrophobic, and there was concern about possible flooding. He then suggested a site he knew well, a flat mesa near Santa Fe, New Mexico, which was the site of a private boys' school, the Los Alamos Ranch School. The engineers were concerned about the poor access road and the water supply, but otherwise felt that it was ideal. The Los Alamos laboratory was built on the site of the school, taking over some of its buildings, while many new buildings were erected in great haste. At the laboratory, Oppenheimer assembled a group of the top physicists of the time, whom he called the luminaries. Los Alamos was initially supposed to be a military laboratory, and Oppenheimer and other researchers were to be commissioned into the army. He went so far as to order himself a lieutenant colonel's uniform and take the army physical test, which he failed. Army doctors considered him underweight at 128 pounds 58 kilograms, diagnosed his chronic cough as tuberculosis, and were concerned about his chronic lumbosacral joint pain. The plan to commission scientists fell through when Robbie and Robert Bocker balked at the idea. Conant, Groves, and Oppenheimer devised a compromise whereby the University of California operated the laboratory under contract to the War Department. It soon turned out that Oppenheimer had hugely underestimated the magnitude of the Project Los Alamos. Grew from a few hundred people in 1943 to over 6,000 in 1945. Oppenheimer at first had difficulty with the organizational division of large groups, but rapidly learned the art of large-scale administration. After he took up permanent residence at Los Alamos, he was noted for his mastery of all scientific aspects of the project and for his efforts to control the inevitable cultural conflicts between scientists and the military. Victor Weisskopf wrote, Oppenheimer directed these studies, theoretical and experimental, in the real sense of the words. Here his uncanny speed in grasping the main points of any subject was a decisive factor. He could acquaint himself with the essential details of every part of the work. He did not direct from the head office. He was intellectually and physically present at each decisive step. He was present in the laboratory or in the seminar rooms when a new effect was measured. When a new idea was conceived, it was not that he contributed so many ideas or suggestions. He did so sometimes, but his main influence came from something else. It was his continuous and intense presence, which produced a sense of direct participation in all of us. It created that unique atmosphere of enthusiasm and challenge that pervaded the place throughout its time. Security concerns. In August 1943, Oppenheimer told Manhattan Project security agents that George Eltonton, whom he did not know, had solicited 3 men at Los Alamos for nuclear secrets on behalf of the Soviet Union. When pressed on the issue in later interviews, Oppenheimer admitted that the only person who had approached him was his friend Håkon Chevalier, a Berkeley professor of French literature, who had mentioned the matter privately at a dinner at Oppenheimer's house. Groves thought Oppenheimer too important to the project to be ousted over this suspicious behavior. On July 20, 1943, he wrote to the Manhattan Engineer District, in accordance with my verbal directions of July 15th, it is desired that clearance be issued to Julius Robert Oppenheimer, without delay irrespective of the information which you have concerning Mir Oppenheimer. He is absolutely essential to the project bomb design. At this point in the war, there was considerable anxiety among the scientists that the German nuclear weapons program might be progressing faster than the Manhattan Project. In a letter dated May 25, 1943, Oppenheimer responded to a proposal by Fermi to use radioactive materials to poison German food supplies. Oppenheimer asked Fermi whether he could produce enough strontium without letting too many in on a secret. Oppenheimer continued, I think we should not attempt a plan unless we can poison food sufficient to kill 500,000 men. In 1943, development efforts were directed to a plutonium gun-type fission weapon called Thin Man. Initial research on the properties of plutonium was done using cyclotron-generated plutonium-239, which was extremely pure but could be created only in tiny amounts. When Los Alamos received the first sample of plutonium from the X-10 graphite reactor in April 1944, a problem was discovered. Reactor-bred plutonium had a higher concentration of plutonium-240, making it unsuitable for use in a gun-type weapon. In July 1944, Oppenheimer abandoned the gun design in favor of an implosion-type weapon, using chemical explosive lenses. A subcritical sphere of fissile material could be squeezed into a smaller and denser form. The metal needed to travel only very short distances, so the critical mass would be assembled in much less time. In August 1944, Oppenheimer implemented a sweeping reorganization of the Los Alamos laboratory to focus on implosion. He concentrated the development efforts on the gun-type device, a simpler design that only had to work with uranium-235 in a single group. This device became Little Boy in February 1945. After a mammoth research effort, the more complex design of the implosion device, known as the Christie gadget after Robert Christie, another student of Oppenheimer's, was finalized in a meeting in Oppenheimer's office on February 28, 1945. In May 1945, an interim committee was created to advise and report on wartime and post-war policies regarding the use of nuclear energy. The interim committee established a scientific panel consisting of Oppenheimer, Arthur Compton, Fermi, and Lawrence to advise it on scientific issues. In its presentation to the interim committee, the panel offered its opinion not just on an atomic bomb's likely physical effects, but also on its likely military and political impact. This included opinions on such sensitive issues as whether the Soviet Union should be advised of the weapon in advance of its use against Japan. Trinity nuclear test. In the early morning hours of July 16, 1945, near Alamogordo, New Mexico, the work at Los Alamos culminated in the test of the world's first nuclear weapon. Oppenheimer had codenamed the site Trinity in mid-1944, saying later that the name came from John Donne's Holy Sonnets. He had been introduced to Donne's work in the 1930s by Jean Tatlock, who killed herself in January 1944. Brigadier General Thomas Farrell, who was present in the control bunker with Oppenheimer, recalled Dr. Oppenheimer, on whom had rested a very heavy burden, grew tenser as the last seconds ticked off. He scarcely breathed. He held on to a post to steady himself. For the last few seconds, he stared directly ahead, and then, when the announcer shouted, "Now!" and there came this tremendous burst of light, followed shortly thereafter by the deep growling roar of the explosion, his face relaxed into an expression of tremendous relief. Oppenheimer's brother Frank recalled Oppenheimer's first words as, "I guess it worked," according to a 1949 magazine profile. While witnessing the explosion, Oppenheimer thought of verses from the Bhagavad Gita: "If the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the Mighty One. Now I am become death, the shatter of worlds." In 1965, he recalled the moment this way: "We knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed. A few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty and, to impress him, takes on his multi-armed form and says, 'Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.' I suppose we all thought that, one way or another." Robbie described seeing Oppenheimer somewhat later. "I'll never forget his walk, like high noon, this kind of strut. He had done it at an assembly at Los Alamos on August 6th, the evening of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. Oppenheimer took to the stage and clasped his hands together like a prize-winning boxer. While the crowd cheered, he expressed regret that the weapon was ready too late for use against Nazi Germany. But on August 17th, Oppenheimer traveled to Washington to hand-deliver a letter to Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson expressing his revulsion and his wish to see nuclear weapons banned. In October, he met with President Harry S. Truman. The meeting went badly after Oppenheimer said, "He felt he had blood on my hands." This remark infuriated Truman, who later told his Undersecretary of State Dean Acheson, "I don't want to see that son of a bitch in office ever again," for his services as director of Los Alamos. Oppenheimer was awarded the Medal for Merit by Truman in 1946. Post-war activities. Once the public learned of the Manhattan Project, after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Oppenheimer, now a household name, known as the father of the atomic bomb, became a national spokesman for science, emblematic of a new type of technocratic power. He appeared on the covers of Life and Time. Nuclear physics became a powerful force as nations realized the strategic and political power That came with nuclear weapons. Like many scientists of his generation, Oppenheimer felt that security from atomic bombs could come only from a transnational organization, such as the newly formed United Nations, which could institute a program to stifle a nuclear arms race. The final years, amidst the post-war turbulence, Oppenheimer continued his academic pursuits. Advocating for international control of nuclear weapons, his brilliance endured. But his past cast a long shadow. The weight of his experiences and the toll of his actions manifested in declining health. On February 18, 1967, J. Robert Oppenheimer passed away, leaving behind a legacy that both inspired and warned. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more and let us know your impression in the comment below.